Hello. So this is a lecture video on DNA structure that you can use to learn about the structure and overall function of DNA as a part of your activity for today. So when we look at DNA at the molecular level, it's described as a double helix. And so what the heck that means is it's a twisted ladder. So, if we stood up a ladder, there's the sides and then there's the rungs in the middle, the steps in the middle. And so DNA has that similar structure. It's just twisted. And the reason that it's twisted is because it allows us to take a lot of DNA and store it in a very, very small space. And so one of the key things that we want you guys to learn from today is that what makes up the sides of our DNA ladder and then what make up our steps or rungs. And so when we look at the sides, it's sometimes called the backbone of the DNA. And it's made up of phosphates and sugars. And so you just take one phosphate and then one sugar, and you just alternate it down each of the sides of our DNA ladder. And then our rungs are made up of things called nitrogen bases. And you can see the nitrogen bases here in this picture. There's the G, C's, and the A's and T's. And we're going to talk about what the heck those are in a little bit more detail next. But for right now, just understand as you fill out your notes that the backbone or sides of our DNA ladder go phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, all the way down. And then our steps are made up of nitrogen bases. And those three things together are what make up the DNA structure. We call it a subunit. So when we have these big complex molecules in living things, they are actually made up of smaller molecules bonded together. So the monomer or subunit of DNA is called a nucleotide. And the nucleotide has three parts: a sugar molecule right here, a phosphate group, and then the nitrogen base. Oh, there we go. And it says here, can you remember the monomers of other organic molecules like carbs, proteins, and lipids? We haven't talked about those yet, so we're going to get into those later. But like I said, all of these big molecules that make up living things like us are actually made of smaller molecules bonded together. So one of the other things that you are going to have to know about DNA is that a nucleotide is the building block or the subunit of DNA, and it's made up of three parts: the phosphate, the sugar, and the nitrogen base. Now, DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and the reason that it gets its name is because the sugar here is called deoxyribose. So it's named for the sugar that makes it up. And DNA is a nucleic acid. So that's why DNA actually stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. Now, these bases here are really important. And there's 4 different bases found in DNA. And they are represented by letters. So if you ever see an A, that stands for adenine. If you see a T, that represents thymine. C stands for cytosine, and G stands for guanine. And now, so remember, we talked about the fact that DNA has 2 sides. And these sides are stuck or bonded together by 2 nitrogen bases bonding. The other thing with this, if I ever go too fast and you're trying to write something down, just pause the video. And you can always replay it or rewatch it if you get confused with anything. That's the nice thing about watching a lecture in the video form, is you can work at your own pace. Besides you having to know the 4 nitrogen bases, you need to know how they pair up, because they are always going to bond in the same way. Adenine is always going to bond with thymine. Guanine is always going to bond with cytosine. Sorry, my eye itches. And it's never going to change. And so it kind of looks a little bit like this. So the orange squares represent the backbone, which would be alternating phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar. And then you would also have adenine, and then these are your nitrogen bases that make up your rungs. So we can see adenine binds with thymine. Cytosine binds with guanine to make the rungs of our DNA ladder. Now I'm curious, what do you think would happen if guanine tried to bind with adenine? Because we can see that never happens. So I want you to pause and think about, what do you think would happen? Welcome back. So most students say that there would be a mutation or something would go wrong or the DNA wouldn't be right. And all of those answers are right. And we're going to talk about what happens when there are errors in our DNA a little bit later on in this unit. So one of the coolest things about DNA is that every organism on Earth has the same structure of DNA. So all living things, their DNA is made up of the monomer nucleotides, which have one of the 4 nitrogen bases. So adenine, thymine, guanosine, and cytosine are the exact same in all living things. What makes every organism different is the order of those A's, T's, G's, and C's in their DNA. And it's the order of those bases that we refer to as the genetic code. So organisms that are more similar to one another share more of their genetic code. For example, the person that's sitting next to you right now doing their work too shares 99.9% of the same DNA. It's that 0.01% difference that makes you unique. And what I think is cool too is that 60% of your DNA is the same as the banana. And that's because a lot of our cells are the same. And so we need to have those order of the A's, T's, G's, and C's the same as well. And so that's why, remember we just did our DNA extraction lab and you saw the DNA as this white cloud. No matter what organism we took that DNA from, we would see that DNA look the same because DNA at the molecular level is the same for all living things. So if we did the DNA extraction lab with some of your cells, it would look the same. Or if we did it with a banana or whatever we wanted to do, it would be the same because all of the structure for all living things of DNA is the exact same. I know I've repeated it a bunch, but I really need you guys to say that. So what we say is the genetic code is universal. So do not forget that. But now let's talk and introduce what is the function of the DNA in all of these living things. And we're going to dive into this more as we work through the unit, but I want to give you guys an overview to kind of give you a foundation of where we're going. So like we said, the order of the bases is referred to as the genetic code. It's what makes us who we are. What it's actually doing is those order of the nitrogen bases are the instructions to make proteins. So you can think about it like the A's, T's, G's, and C's are like the letters in a book that make words. So the words are like the proteins that our cells are going to make. And then all of those proteins work together to build the organism and to give the organism its characteristics. And so the organism is like the story. And proteins do almost all of the jobs in a cell and in an organism. And most proteins are made by your cell, but not used in the same form that you eat them. So when I say that we're going to be talking about proteins and how your body makes proteins, I'm not talking about you eating chicken at home. Yes, it's mostly made up of proteins, but the proteins we're going to be talking about is much bigger than that. Because if you look at this table, we are going to see all these different types of proteins in the next coming weeks and how your body and how other organisms make all of these different proteins and why they are important. Because all the instructions for all of these different types of protein come from the DNA. And so there's one other keyword that I need you guys to know, and that is a gene. And so when we look, I'm going to hide that for a second. When we look at our DNA here, the order of the A's, T's, G's, and C's are going to have the instructions for a protein. This section of the DNA that makes this specific protein is called a gene. So humans have 20,000 to 25,000 genes that we know of. We're still trying to figure all those out. And these proteins that are made also determine your traits. So they're doing jobs in your body and they're helping your cells and your overall body to function, but they also determine your traits. The reason that your eyes are a specific color is because of a protein that is being made. Your height, all of this stuff is determined by genes in your DNA. And just remember that your DNA is packaged into chromosomes. So that's why it's a twisted ladder. So we can take all of this DNA, package it into chromosomes, and then squish it all inside the nucleus of your cells. The other important part, and so this gives you guys, remember we talked about the order or the scale of DNA. So the DNA is made up of genes. All of our DNA is packaged into chromosomes, which are then inside the nucleus, which is housed inside of our cells. So remember that order and that scale of which things make up which, because you guys are going to see that on a quiz. And so the last thing about function is, in addition to coding proteins, DNA allows us to store the information to make an organism so that it can be passed on. Now, this is important because you are constantly making new cells all the time. When you get cut or cells are old, they need to be replaced. But we need to make sure that the new cells have the exact same DNA as the previous cells. And so we're going to talk about, well, how does that happen? How do we ensure that every cell has the same DNA? But that's a key thing, is that it allows us to pass on that genetic information. So all of our cells in our body have the same genetic information, but it also allows us to pass on the genetic information to an offspring when an organism reproduces. So we're going to talk about both of these things in more detail throughout this unit. But right now, you just need to know that overall function. And that is the end of it. So remember, you can always go back, pause, rewind, rewatch if you need to, or use the other resources linked in today's work to help you review the DNA structure and function before you go on and do the Kahoot. If you need anything, ask your teachers. Have a good day.